Oh, thanks so much, guys, and thank you for having me. Yeah, we're digging out of about 8 inches of snow here, and I'm in Westport, Connecticut, where I grew up, and I'm talking to you from Compo Beach, which is about a half a mile from the Fitzgerald's honeymoon cottage, where they spent 5 months in the summer of 1920, an incredibly formative experience in their lives. And so let me tell you how this is going to happen. If you guys could just mute for now, we'll take questions at the end. We can do it by chat, or we can do it by you guys unmuting and asking questions directly. Looks like we have a small group, so maybe we'll just, you can ask me questions directly. You're not going to see a lot of me. That's good news, of course. You're going to see me at the beginning and the end. This is going to be entirely of visuals. Some of the images you're going to see have never been seen before, and frankly, never will be again. And I'll explain why in just a minute. So I'm going to go straight to the first PowerPoint, okay? And again, guys, let me know if you can't see stuff, but I think you can see this. This is my book, so you got to start with a shameless plug. Boats Against the Current. It's a centennial edition because this was a century ago last summer that the Fitzgeralds were here, and we had an unbelievable amount of things planned for this year, but obviously that didn't happen. The reason the book's called Boats Against the Current is that it's the last line of the Great Gatsby, more or less. It's in the last sentence. And when I started this journey to try to prove that Westport was important to the Fitzgerald's collective experience, I was told by one of the leading Fitzgerald academics, he said, Deej, which is my nickname, he said, Deej, if you get Westport in the top 25 places that influenced the Fitzgeralds, it's a noble, but it's a totally lost cause. But what I found out was, and this was simply by doing the homework, I'm a retired educator, 24 years, and I used to tell my high school and college students, look for yourself, look at primary documents. So what I did was I read everything that they ever wrote, and I read everything that was written about them, and that was a very pleasant task. But I'm just going to go through this very quickly. It turned out to be the place they wrote about the most and what was the most influential. So instead of not being in the top 25, it was number one. So I'll be looking at many of these things. In the top middle, Scott wrote The Beautiful and Damned. Half of that was written in Westport, and half about it is Westport, the fictionalized town of Marietta. And it's about a couple who, among other things, have a honeymoon. And Scott wrote straight from his experience. As Scott Fitzgerald said, all my characters are of Scott Fitzgerald. And by the way, most of the women were Zelda. In her only novel, Save Me the Waltz, she also writes about the Westport period. And yes, her characters are in a honeymoon, and she's writing about herself in her only play, Scandalabra. She takes the premise of The Beautiful and Damned and reverses it and talks about Westport. It shows up in 5 of Scott's short stories. It shows up in one of his major essays called The Cruise of the Rolling Junk. And of course, it shows up in The Great Gatsby. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through the first segment pretty quickly, because it's going to set up, which I think what you all want to see, which is Gatsby. But this is really, really important about The Beautiful and Damned to kind of set up our story. So here they are. They got married in April of 1920. They were only in New York City for 5 weeks before they moved to Westport, where they spent 5 months. And the reason they left New York was they essentially got kicked out of New York City. So you can imagine that. That's quite the achievement. Probably the 2 most famous stories were when they were kicked out of both the Commodore and the Biltmore, which were the hotels in New York City. The last one they were kicked out of because they spent 30 minutes revolving in a brand new invention called the revolving door. And therefore, nobody could get in or out of the hotel. So they were kicked out of their hotel, and they buy a secondhand Marmon, and they're on their way to Lake Champlain. They're halfway there, Scott finds out and writes in a very famous letter that the water is too cold in Lake Champlain And as he said to Ruth Sturdivant in this letter, if Zelda can't swim, she's miserable. So what they do is they essentially, the only place you could go between New York and Boston was the Post Road. They took a right and they came to Westport, Connecticut, because they heard it had water. Here he writes half of this book, and half of the book takes place in Westport in the fictional town of Marietta. One of my favorite things about this cover of this book was that Scott said, well, the artist got Zelda pretty well, but that looks like a pretty debauched version of myself. And again, I'm going to move quickly through this part, okay? So this is bad teaching, as I would say. I'm going to move rapidly. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to airlift quotes from The Beautiful and Damned. This is by no means comprehensive. So you can read this for yourself as I talk. This is the Gray House that he writes about in the book. He calls it the Gray House. It was owned by the Gray family, one of the oldest families in Westport. It was painted gray when they were there, and it's painted gray to this day. And I just love this passage because the mention of the witches and Paul Revere, it is indeed a pre-revolutionary house. And by the way, it is in almost perfect shape from when they were there. And I lead tours on behalf of the Westport Historical Society, where I lead people for a 2.5-hour walk for 4 miles through the geography of Westport that shows up in The Beautiful Damned and The Great Gatsby. Again, just showing you that the house still exists. That porch on the left is straight out of the time they were there. There's a very famous picture of them from there. There was an addition on the right that you can see there, and there's been additions on the back, but the house is completely intact otherwise. Now, don't worry about this. This is a bit overwhelming. It's an aerial map of where the Fitzgeralds lived, and it's an aerial map done by Google Maps that shows the a big main scene in The Beautiful and Damned, which was a big main scene that occurred in their marriage. So when I talk about Gloria Patch, the newlywed, it's Zelda. When I talk about Anthony Patch, the newlywed, it's Scott. Again, Scott famously writing, all my characters are F. Scott Fitzgerald. So what he did was he wrote from his own life. By the way, as a writer, this makes writing easier because you have material. And what he did after this was he borrowed from his own short stories and books, and he put them in new short stories and books. And so as Charles Scribner III, the grandson of the great House of Scribner that published Hemingway, Woolf, and Fitzgerald, and he's also an executive producer on our film set, he said, Deej, The Beautiful and Damned was the dry run for the Great Gatsby. So that's why I'm going to go through it with you. So don't worry if you can't follow this because you'll get it. Here's the Fitzgerald house. Gloria / Zelda. What was happening was they were having a gigantic party. Their parties would start on Thursday nights, and everybody was supposed to leave by Sunday night, but they stayed till Wednesday morning. So we're talking 6-day parties. Zelda's 19 at this time. Scott's only 24. So we got a post-grad guy and we got a college kid, right? Fantastic. So their youth was, as Dorothy Parker said, their youth was striking. And as she said, it looked like they stepped right out of the sun. So what's happening at this party? One of Scott's friends starts to drunkenly hit on Zelda, and she freaks out. And in a howling storm, she runs out of their house. And let me just show you this. And by the way, this is exactly what the character Gloria does. So Zelda / Gloria runs out of the house, runs up to East Ferry Lane, runs up East Ferry Lane, comes up and goes to the train station. So let me take you through that. Okay, so again, what's fun is that when I lead these tours, I often have segments of the novel and I show people as we walk, and it's staggering. As Walter Robichek said, the great Fitzgerald academic, he said, there's no single book, fiction book in the 20th century that reflects the geography in which it was written as much as The Beautiful and Damned. So that's Westport. So Zelda runs out of the house. Scott's drunken ex-roommate is, again, been hitting on her. She runs away in fear. And she goes down the house and starts down the path. And pretty soon thereafter, she comes upon this barn. The barn's still there. I actually almost bought this house this summer until I decided to buy another one. But this red barn is still there, incredibly. And at that time, the town of Westport's about a mile away from here. This was the only house between the town of Westport and where the Fitzgeralds were staying. Again, just showing you again, there's the barn. She takes a left. She goes down the fork of the road. She sees the road in front of her. So again, just to point out, I'm just showing you excerpts of the novel. There's much, much more. And the way I realized this was when I was a child. I used to ride my bike around the Westport, as kids do. And when I was 14, I read The Beautiful and Damned. And I was stunned. I was like, oh my God, this is a road map of Westport. The characters take a left here, they take a right here, they go around a traffic circle there. And I thought I had found a great discovery until I found out that this indeed was the case. And as I'll talk about later, when I read The Great Gatsby 2 years later at the age of 16, I said, well, is Westport in this? And I kind of thought about a couple of things, but I didn't put it together until I read something, and we'll talk about that. I'm going to shut up and let you read this because this is pretty critical. Okay, again, as Charles Scribner said, The Beautiful and Damned was the dry run for The Great Gatsby. Now, I love Scott's description of these railroad towers as a big, gigantic spider. Classic Scott, beautifully described. But look at that, the little green light. What is the green light? It's the single most important symbol in American fiction in the entire 20th century. It's the single most important symbol of the American dream in Gatsby, as you know. And here he is. He's already trying it out. And this is going to be 5 years before The Great Gatsby. And again, showing you excerpts, Zelda / Gloria Patch runs down this train bridge. And by the way, in the book, it's described as a yard wide. And by the way, today, it's exactly 3 feet wide. When you get halfway down the bridge and look to your right, you'll see the town of Westport, just like you see it there. Now, you don't really see it because it's forested. And at the time, it would have been deforested. Westport was an agrarian farming community, by and large, when they came there. So you would have seen it. So literally, you stop, you take a look, down right, and there is the town of Westport. She goes to the train station. Scott and her used to love to party all night and climb on the roof of this train station. By the way, it still exists, just like it did back then, with slight modifications. And they used to sit on the roof of this and wait for the 5:33 to New York City, where they would continue their party. By the way, it took 70 minutes in 1920 to get to New York from Westport then. And by the way, it takes at least as long now. So I'm gonna stop the share really quickly, and just give me a second. And I'm going to transition to The Great Gatsby. So again, here's a picture of the book, and that's a picture of them in front of their honeymoon cottage. Now, what's interesting about this is it's 4 years later. They came here for a photo shoot for the Cruise of the Rolling Junk, a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful short story. So it's really interesting is that they're here a year before Gatsby, and they take a series of photos. So it's pretty convincing to think that just a year before Gatsby, that they're reorienting themselves with Westport's geography. By the way, the popular theory is, of course, that it's all about Great Neck, Long Island, and it is partly about Great Neck, Long Island. Westport and Great Neck are what I like to call a beachy blend of the Great Gatsby. And just to let you know, when we showed our film to the head of the Great Neck Historical Society, Alice Caston, she said, after watching it, she said that Great Neck concedes to Westport as the setting for the Great Gatsby. Here they are again. I just wanted to show you this. They were America's first pop stars, without question. All popular culture in America begins with the Fitzgeralds. You're going to have Babe Ruth and people like that later, but this is the birth of really mass media, and they were the first cultural rock stars in American history. So what I did was, again, I had belief that The Beautiful and Damned, which I found out was, fairly common knowledge, was written about Westport. And I thought about The Great Gatsby. I thought, well, this scene could have happened there and this could have happened there. But it wasn't until 1996 in the September issue of The New Yorker where I read Barbara Probst-Solomon's article. She lived, her family estate was across from the Fitzgeralds, and she put out a stunning argument. So the problem with this argument was it went against the theories of the leading Fitzgerald biographer, Matthew Bruckley, who we owe a tremendous debt to. But he squashed the theory. He pressured the board of the New Yorker not to republish it. So what I did for years and years and years was I did a PowerPoint, and I went around to schools, I went around to universities, I went around to schools, and I tried to, in libraries, and I tried to, prove her point. And, a lot of the film that I'll talk about later came out of this. Here is the estate on which they lived on the corner of. This was the estate of the mystery millionaire, F.E. Lewis. 175 acres large. This is the main house. It's completely still there. It's been added on to. The Fitzgeralds, who lived on the corner of the estate, used to walk down from their small little cottage and come down here and party at the house and go swim at the beach. Here's his massive boathouse complex and marina, and we'll talk about it. So, who is F.E. Lewis? Well, when I started to research him, there was a single thing on the internet. This was 7 years ago. And he was being investigated for his bank holdings in a New York bank. And this was during the Progressive era, when the government was looking at financial holdings of individuals and trying to tame the excesses of capitalism. And I'll show you him in just a second. But keep in mind that this is the only geography that perfectly fits the Great Gatsby. Great Neck, where they lived, when I actually went there, was 2.5 miles from the water. And they did not live next to a giant mystery millionaire. But in Westport, they did. The house is still there on the corner of the still extant 175-acre estate, which is now the Longshore Club. Here he is in all his glory. The young F.E. Lewis on the left with a pipe at Longshore. There he is in the middle at the height of what I'd like to call his powers. And there he is at the helm of one of his many, many ships, which I'll be showing you, wearing a cowboy hat, which is very important also. And I'll be showing you that. What does F.E. Lewis have the luck to do? Well, he inherits at the age of 21, $240 million in today's money. Where did that money come from? His great, great, great was a guy by the name of Moses Taylor, one of the first major bankers in American history, and is number 21 on the list of America's richest people. So that's where he got what I'd like to call the seed money. And by the way, this is before federal and state income taxes. Here's the house. Is it a mansion? Sure, by 1920 standards. It's, a lot of people think of Gatsby and they think about the houses that they see in the film. which are these kind of chateau, big Norman turreted affairs. And indeed, in Gatsby, it's described more or less as that. But as Charles Scribner pointed out to me, he said, Deej, remember at the end of the novel, what Nick Carraway describes the house as is this glorious ramshackle house. And you're looking at a pretty ramshackle house. It's big, it's a mansion, but a lot of competing architectural styles. Here it is today. It's the Longshore Golf and Country Club. It's totally public. Here is the body of the original house. Here's what I like to call the nose job. That's the inn, and in the back is a restaurant. Barbara Probst Solomon's house was over here. It had the longest dock in the vicinity. Yes, it had a green light at the end of it. They also had a lighthouse with a green light. And Scott and Zelda used to swim at this F.E. Lewis's estate, and they would look directly across it. By the way, this is the #1 wedding destination in Connecticut, and it was voted the 9th best golf course today. In Gatsby, Nick says, instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, which is what Scott and Zelda did. So from their little cottage, they would take a shortcut to F.E. Lewis's place. They would cut through what is now the golf course. But sometimes they did what Nick Carraway says. Instead of taking the shortcut by the Sound, we walked down the road and we entered into the great posterns. And here they are. Here's F.E. Lewis's posterns, put in 3 years before the Fitzgeralds got there. This is one of the big highlights of the tour for people to see this. One of the most dramatic examples of the geography of Westport showing up in the Great Gatsby. Look at this party scene from 1920. Awesome, okay? There's a reflecting pool here with lily pads. There's a band shell here with dancers. And there's a full-piece jazz band and people partying around the edges. Remember in Gatsby, one of the most dramatic passages to show that Jay Gatsby is like incredibly wealthy was he says that there, is a band there, not just some little band, but a full piece affair. And here you see a full piece jazz band. Now keep in mind that this is, like Nick Carraway, this is Scott's first summer in the East. It's his first summer exposed to immense wealth. It's his first summer certainly living on the corner of an estate of a mystery millionaire. All right, we'll talk about this more, but here are some of his champion horses that F.E. Lewis had on the estate. It was a massive estate with riding trails, very rare horses we'll talk about, sculptured gardens, second to none, and became a very, very big tourist attraction about a decade and a half after he left. Well, here we go back to why I showed you a picture of him with a cowboy hat. There he is. Well, that's like Gatsby. He owned another property. What did he own? 8,000 acres on coastal California, a gigantic ranch called Diamond Bar that you're seeing there. 8,000 acres, so large that he built a house halfway between the 8,000 acres, because you would travel most of the day for the 4,000 acres, and then you'd stop, spend the night, and see the other 4,000 acres. He was a champion cattle rancher. He was a champion hog rancher. His hogs, the Duroc hogs, were the most famous in the country. He developed massive feeding systems, you see at the top left, that are still in use today. And there he is on one of his champion Arabian horses. By the way, Diamond Bar comes from, for all his livestock, he branded them with a brand that had a diamond over a bar. That was the brand. So he called it the Diamond Bar Branch. That's now the entire city of Diamond Bar, California, where Alexis Morgan, the great soccer player, is from, and Snoop Dogg, the great rapper, is from. But there he is on top of Musan, his prize-winning steed. The Arabians were not popular horses in America until F.E. Lewis, with another man, brought them into the country. And there he is on his major steed. His one major stud was Buffalo Bill Cody's favorite horse that he rode in all of his great Wild West shows. So he's not only a very wealthy man with 2 giant properties, but he is one of the major equestrian figures in American history. Now, here you're going to see, and I showed you this briefly in that overhead shot, you're seeing a tower, okay? And I'll be explaining what you see to the right in just a second, because that was his boathouse complex. But there's this tower, and you might remember in The Great Gatsby, Nick talking about the guests of Gatsby diving from the tower of his raft. And here you see the tower. And indeed, before it, he had 2 floating rafts that were immensely popular. But here is just kind of a kicker. This was his boathouse complex. So not only, you know, champion horseman, millionaire with 2 giant properties, he also owned a veritable flotilla of ships. Here are the spars that he would use to move his ships in here for winter storage. Here's one of his ships. That was his first yacht. It was called the Kima. It had 55 sailors. It burned 4 tons of coal at sea a day. It cost $1.5 million in today's money just to keep at dry dock. Why do you see U.S. Navy sailors here? Well, because he donated this ship to the U.S. government in World War I, never asked for it back, and it patrolled Battery Park in New York City. So this was his main yacht when he was there. Here he is again, and now you know why he's wearing the cowboy hat. Here he is at the helm of one of his many ships. He had about 12 there besides his main yacht. One of the things he had were 2 of the fastest speedboats in the country, powered by aircraft engines beyond belief in terms of their speed, called hydroplanes. So a hydroplane was a very powerful speedboat. And remember, in Gatsby, one of the great staggering comments that Nick makes in The Great Gatsby is that Gatsby turns to him and says, "Hey, Nick, why don't we take a spin around the Sound in my hydroplane?" So instantly, audiences of 1925 would have said, "Oh, wow, major speedboat, hydroplane, wealthy guy." But keep in mind, I'm going to show you something even more dramatic pretty soon. Remember that The Great Gatsby's 50,000 words. Every sentence, more or less, means something. It's that tightly crafted. It's like what Mark Twain said. "Sorry for writing you a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." Get it? To make it concise. Anybody can babble forever, but to put it into 50,000 words. So the hydroplane has a double meaning that will convey the wealth of Gatsby. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's one of his succeeding 7 strangers. Look at the size of this ship. This is out of Los Angeles. He had another one later that came out of Honolulu. In 1938, he had the largest non-governmental craft in America, meaning what ships were bigger than F.E. Lewis's? Battleships, aircraft carriers. And indeed, in 1938, he did a deep Southeastern Asian voyage. And what did he do? He spied covertly for the U.S. government on Japanese naval and air installations in Southeast Asia. And indeed, 3 years later, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor. Now, here's the other hydroplane. This is a hydro seaplane. Seaplane. Now, these are, and this is off the Lewis estate. These were so rare at the time. Folks, this is 1917. The airplane is a brand new invention for the most part. To have a seaplane was even more incredibly rare. And by the way, they're so dangerous that most insurance companies don't insure them to this day. So when Fitzgerald writes, "Hey, old sport, you want to take a spin in my hydroplane along the Sound?" It has a double meaning. It's pregnant with a double meaning. Many of the audience would say, "Oh, wow, it's a big speedboat." Some of the audience would say, "Oh my God, it's a seaplane." What Fitzgerald really intended was that you would think it was both. And so to own this would have been like having one of Elon Musk's rockets at your estate, today. By the way, he also allowed the U.S. Army Air Corps, there wasn't an Air Force then, to practice takeoffs and landings off of his estate. So there you go. Horseman, ranch owner, estate owner, and pilot. Well, doesn't end there. There he is at Longshore with his first wife and his chauffeur. By the way, he had 4 wives, his 4th one being the 18-year-old roommate of his former college roommate. I wonder how the 18-year-old wife of his former college roommate, I wonder how that played out. But in researching him, I found tons of references to him being a race car driver from about 1907 to about 1915. I'd like to tell you that he won these races. That would make a great story. He didn't, but he came in 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and 6th place. I love it. In one 1911 race, he lost to a car that was going at a top speed of 40 miles an hour. Now, he owned 3 immensely wealthy cars, among the others. 2 of them today are worth 160 grand. One of them a cool $250,000. But here's where the Gatsby-esque-ness of this man goes off the charts. So I'll give you a second to just read the top headline, the top left half of that box, and the one on the right, the top right half of that box. Okay. This is the greatest party in Connecticut history. Pound for pound, it might be the greatest party in American history. It was a 1917 fundraiser for World War I. It lasted all day. Fun note was that 800 cars were noted parking there. Now, 800 cars in 1917. Well, first of all, that tells you this is a wealthy group of partygoers. And I don't know if there were 1,200 cars in the entire state of Connecticut. But it was this gigantic party with many, many things happening. First of all, you had airplanes that would take people and fly with them. Flying in 1917, again, the only sort of reference I think I could make to this was if you were to take a suborbital flight into space today. Nobody had done this. This is a spectacular thing to be able to do. Ina Claire performs in a show there. Who's Ina Claire? Well, she's the first naturalistic actress in American history. She was making $5,000 a week in that day's money. She was Fitzgerald's favorite actress. He had photos of her cut up and all over his dorm room wall at Princeton, and he wanted her to play Nicole in the 1934 version of the Hollywood film Tender is the Night. David Belasco directed her play. Who's David Belasco? Well, in the Belasco Theater in New York City today, he is said to haunt it. He's the one who was the template for all the stage design and lighting you will see in any Broadway show today, in any musical. He's the one who invented it. Houdini came. I don't think I got to describe who Houdini is. In most of his stunts, he was pushed off a dock in a locked box. F.E. Lewis takes it one step further. He lowers them well deeply out into Long Island Sound at the end of a crane, the crane that he used to dredge his harbor. And of course, Houdini escapes. But we're talking about the #1 attraction in America at that time was Houdini. Annette Kellerman shows up and does swimming classes. She's the one who invented the sport of synchronized swimming, and she also invented the most radical innovation in women's swimwear to that date. It was called the one piece. Very daring, body hugging. It was Zelda Fitzgerald's favorite swimsuit, and intentionally, Zelda picked the light tan beige color, which made her look naked. And she was very much into that, and she did it intentionally for that purpose. Marceline the Clown. Yep, bet you haven't heard of him. So famous that in an era today when Britney Spears does a 1-year residency or Celine Dion does a 1-year residency in Las Vegas, he did a 10-year residency at the most historic and largest New York City venue, the Hippodrome. He had his own cartoon strip after him called Marceline the Clown. Why is he so important? He's the template for the greatest single cinematic figure in world history, Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin said, "I am Marceline. I copied Marceline." A whole animal circus came out. Believe it or not, back in that time period, circus animals were kept down in the Village in New York City. They were kept on McDougal Street. And they were leased out to, like, you know, Broadway plays and operas and musicals and etc. But he has half of them taken from barge from Manhattan to Longshore. The other half he takes by private train and has them detrained, and they walk the mile through the streets of Westport to the estate. The biggest thing, I think, well, besides that, was the pièce de résistance of the whole day. And by the way, I did analysis of all the bankers and industrialists and the who's who and the society people that showed up. And their collective value in today's money was in the tens of billions of dollars. The pièce de résistance of the whole it's an all-day affair. And I'm only describing part of this. I'm giving you the highlights. But you hear the thunder of hooves. People are looking around. Where is this coming from? All of a sudden, over the crest of the hill, you see a stagecoach. It's a real stagecoach brought from California by special train by Lewis, being chased by Native Americans. Yes. Real Native Americans, Sioux, Lakota, Apache, brought in from the West, chased by cowboys. Yes, real Western cowboys. And who's at the head of this cowboy rescue mission? It's, of course, F.E. Lewis on one of his Arabians, dressed all in white with a giant white 10-gallon hat. So this is the estate that the Fitzgeralds find themselves living on the corner of in a small cottage in the summer of 1920. I'll give you a second to read these headlines. They enter in the first year of Prohibition, and then I'll talk about a couple of them. So these are all from the time of 1920 when they were in Westport. This is the first year of Prohibition, but lucky for the Fitzgeralds, they come into a town that in a mock election says that they're not going to obey Prohibition by a 3-2 margin. They come into a town where half the cops are Italian Americans, and the Italian Americans, because of the role of the Sacramento wine and the great tradition of growing your own wine, had no interest in enforcing Prohibition. enforcing it. The other half were two Irish cops, and I could say this because I'm more than part Irish. They had no interest in enforcing prohibition. Indeed, the state of Connecticut and the state of Rhode Island were the only two states that never ratified prohibition. You might ask why. Why? Because they had the largest per capita population of Italian Americans in the country. And part of my research, at least 7 years ago, I don't know if this has changed, it probably hasn't, but they still do. So I thought that was very interesting. So the only busts that were made in town were by the feds. The cops turned a total blind eye. Top center, $17,000 worth of booze held up. That's $250,000 in today's money. And by the way, that taxi that turned over, they were wondering why this taxi only drove around during the day. And they found out when it flipped over, because the lights didn't work. Because the lights were full of booze. Fenders were full of booze. The wheel wells were full of booze. The spare tire was full of booze. They had a spare gas tank that was full of booze. Matter of fact, that made the real gas tank so small that they often had to stop frequently for gas. So again, they came into a town that wildly exploited prohibition, and lucky for them. Now, I'll give you a second. The main thing is I'll explain the thing on the right, but if you could read the article on the left from that summer of 1920, and then I'll explain it. Okay, what's the Miramar Inn? It's the most famous speakeasy between New York and Boston. Humphrey Bogart, Jimmy Cagney absolutely adored it. So did George Raft. And it's a mile away from the Fitzgerald house. You know, chances were that what they were doing was they were drinking even before they were on their way to the Miramar, owned by an Italian American, of course. And what's interesting here is you see something that shows up directly in The Great Gatsby. He gets in an accident, and what's he lose? His wheel. Until you plagiarize it, it's not your own. It's a phrase I like to use. What do I mean by that? Well, plagiarization, as I used to tell my students, is not a bad thing necessarily. For example, I plagiarized teaching the American Revolution. I wasn't there, so I had to use other sources. I had to plagiarize them, but I made them my own, and I, tried to, make them original. So what's Scott doing? He's plagiarizing his own life. He loses a wheel, and in the famous party scene at Gatsby, what does one of the guests do? He gets in an accident, leaving the estate, and he loses a wheel. Westport, straight into The Great Gatsby. On the right is the other major speakeasy in Westport, as I talked about when I was a historian in the Prohibition documentary, Connecticut Goes Dry. If it was a restaurant at that time period, it was a speakeasy. There's basically a rule you can follow. So here's the Campo Inn. Down that steep road, we have two eyewitness accounts of Zelda hanging on to the hood ornament of a taxi. In one of those accounts, she's naked. You can pick whatever account you want, but I want to turn your attention to the man on the right. That's Bald Jack Rose. He's bald because he had alopecia. He controlled rum running in Westport. All the booze that was in Westport was through Bald Jack Rose. Now, he is very well, might be the template for Meyer Wolfsheim, the great bootlegger in The Great Gatsby. And the reason why I really, really think he is, and Barbara did, was that Meyer Wolfsheim talks about the murder at the Metropole in The Great Gatsby. And what Bald Jack Rose did was he turned state's evidence in real life about the murder of Rosie Rosenthal at the Metropole. So straight out of Westport, Bald Jack Rose, the template also for Meyer Wolfsheim. I'll give you a second to just read these headlines. Well, folks, if you thought the 1960s were wild, this is 1919 and 1920, okay? And I just want to point out that the reason I'm showing you these pictures is these are the ones that I could actually photograph off of microfilm that were good enough quantity. So believe it or not, we've got nude orgies mentioned more than twice. And indeed, Edmund Wilson, the great theater critic, literary critic, who was one of Scott's friends at Princeton, said that Scott and Zelda were engaged in the nude orgies of Westport. So, and Zelda did skinny dip. They did skinny dip. And so all of this, right, this over the top decadence, wealth, and frankly, fun, right? You can see it's just a perfect template for Gatsby. Here is just the sale of the house in 1925 after he divorces his first wife. It's in Country Life, which just exemplifies the fact that it was a very desirable estate, 175 acres, a mile of seafront, 6 baths, vacuum heat, very, very rare, fireproof stables, tennis courts, woods, and pasture. And again, 70 minutes by rail from New York City. Takes that long today. Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable. This is our film. The New Yorker just published its top 36 films of 2020. That's all the films made in America. And we came in at number 30. And it's available on Amazon. It's available on iTunes. For some reason, Amazon has taken it down with a bunch of other films. We don't know why. So probably the best way to do it is to find it on iTunes, but it's on a million other different platforms. So let me take and again, shameless plug. Here's the book, Amazon. Being the probably the most easiest way to get this. So I'm going to stop this share. So give me a second. I'm going to share. Okay. Well, that's disappeared. So let me just give me a second. This is where it always tends to get. Give me a few minutes just to clear some stuff up. I would like to show you a clip from our film. So just give me a second here. We're almost there, folks. We really are, so hold on. Okay, so what you're about to see is a short 3-minute clip from Gatsby in Connecticut. So what you're going to see is Sam Waterston, who played Nick Carraway in the 1974 version. You're going to see Bobby Lanahan, who is the only Fitzgerald grandchild who talks to the media. And I think you're going to enjoy this clip. I'm just going to make sure that the sound's on. It is. So please enjoy.
Who was Jay Gatsby modeled on? I find it interesting that so many people are digging into who were the sources for Gatsby. There have been some specific names proposed, and then there have been other theories, so we may never know.
I heard he was in oil from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Texas.
I knew somebody who grew up with him in St. Paul.
Well, you look at him sometimes when he doesn't know anyone's looking at him. You can see it in his eyes. I bet he did kill a man.
Which one is he?
Yes, there is something ultimately about Gatsby that we never quite know.
You're not supposed to be able to grasp it.
Right,
Yeah.
his essence, yeah.
But I don't think there's any one person who served as a model for Gatsby.
He took his experience, of course, as you're saying, it all comes from your own experience, but he blends different times of his life, different people he knew with himself, and creates composites. In fact, Hemingway wrote him a famous letter criticizing him for that. You should base one character on one person, like I do. Like
Really?
Hemingway does, yeah.
You could have the ambition and the pretense that you would be able to see so thoroughly into another person's character that no part of you would show up in the description.
And
I'm not sure I believe
No,
that.
I don't either. And I think Fitzgerald wrote him back and rejected.
It all converges on Gatsby, and Gatsby is inexhaustible.
All those people who claim to have a piece of Scott's original raw material in their community, they might have a partial truth.
Everyone's colored by their own prejudice of where they grew up. So when we interview people from Long Island, they're all convinced Gatsby's from Long Island.
The danger of writing a book about Gatsby is that you then hear from all these people all over the world who've got the key.
We're not supposed to read Gatsby and think Westport. That wasn't Fitzgerald's intention. He wanted us to read Gatsby and think Long Island. But since he didn't have those experiences on Long Island, since they came out of his magic year of 1920 on Westport, where he had a beach, he had a cottage next to a mysterious recluse, that's what he's using as his model.
I think the interesting thing about all of these speculations and surmises and everything is that it's great if it enlivens the book. It's awful if it weighs it down.
My father was on the scene when we started to lose our way during Gatsby's time, and he recorded it all. The generosity, the greed, the innocence, and the cynicism, the magnificence and the waste that was America between the two world wars. People read him now for clues and guidelines, as if by understanding him and his beautiful and damn period, they could see more clearly what's wrong.
The thing that jumps out for me is she also puts in and his beautiful and damn period, which is
I can see that puts it right in your movie.
Yeah.
So, I hope you guys can see me. Please confirm that that is the case. Okay, good. So there you go. You know, a lot of fun to do. What was great, again, is I used to tell my students, you know, the same stuff you probably heard your teacher say, you know, think for yourself, look for yourself. And, you know, we were all like, okay, just give me an A+. I don't have time to look this stuff up. But indeed, I learned that, so, you know, I'm not boasting because I'm not. By the way, if you want to make $1 million writing a book or making a movie, spend $3 million. Okay, it's just, we went broke doing this, and we could care less. We really could care less. Well, maybe my partner could care less, but I mean, maybe I could, but my partner. But to, you know, be told you're not going to get it in the top 25, and to then find that it's number one, and to go against the single biggest academic in Fitzgerald history, Matthew Buckley, and then find out and be told that you'd made the biggest discovery in the last half century of Fitzgerald scholarship. That's my big takeaway. And just another thing I wanted to say before I stop, and we'll take some questions, was that I did this truly as a gift to the town of Westport, a town that, you know, forgets its own history. There's probably a lot of that. the great historian Neil Ferguson said, America will not collapse because of political deficit. America will not collapse because of economic deficit. America will collapse because of its attention deficit. And our attention deficit to our history is it's pretty marked. And one last thing I want to say that's just incredible, and the history repeats itself category, but it is really incredible in this example, is exactly a century ago when the Fitzgeralds were here in 2020. They faced 3 exact crises that we do today. A pandemic in which the only prevention was a face mask, the influenza, and not to make light of COVID, but instead of 2 million people worldwide, as COVID did, it killed 50 million. So pandemic. Number 2, the greatest race riots in American history since the Civil War, 37 American cities, with the largest amount of lynchings and the highest membership in the KKK ever. Okay. Depression so intense, they called it the Great Depression. And the 4th thing was looming. It wouldn't happen for a few more years, but it was the great debate whether or not science mattered. And that was the Scopes monkey trial, the great debate between evolution and creationism. So I've always loved that. It's staggering, you know, what goes around comes around. So I guess instead of a chat, because I'm not seeing any chat questions, if anybody's got some oral questions, you know, I'd be happy to take them.